would tell me your full names first of all, and narrate, please, what happened on September 24th of this year.
My name is Stephanie Weiner.
My name is Joe Iosbaker.
And we're two of the people whose house was raided on September 24th, and two of the 14 people who were subpoenaed to participate in the grand jury.
Would you narrate for me, kind of chronologically, or just kind of tell me what happened that day, from when it all started to what you were told? I mean, what exactly happened September 24th?
Well, you can imagine it was quite a shock. We were both on our way to work, and they came to the door, and we experienced, we saw the warrant, and as people know at this point, we went through quite a shocking day in which by the end of the day we had over 25 agents in our house inspecting every aspect of our house and our personal belongings. And by the end of nearly 11 hours of investigation and the raid, almost 30 boxes were taken from our home. Did you want to add?
And so it began, you told me around 7 a.m. it began. What time did the FBI agents finally leave?
I think it was about 6:30 when they left. They, I can't remember the exact moment, but so it was over 11 hours.
When they came, what did they tell you? How did they present themselves in terms of, were they asking or telling you what to do? And did any forced entry? Were they polite or were they direct?
They were direct. They didn't have to force entry because I opened the door. There were half a dozen. I came down the stairs. There were, I don't know, half a dozen, 8, 10 people on our front porch, and I opened the door. The first man said he was with the FBI. He showed his FBI badge, and then he said he had a warrant to search our home. And I understand when they have a warrant, that means that you can't refuse them to search your home. So I read the warrant briefly and then told them that I was going to go upstairs to show the warrant to Stephanie, and several of them came with me. And we looked over the warrant together and understood that they weren't going to wait around for us to discuss it. By the time we came downstairs, several more who must have been in cars on the street had come in, so within minutes there were 15 or so agents in our home.
And what then happened? I assume they began rummaging, looking through your house. What were they looking for?
The warrant said that they were looking for evidence that we were involved in providing material support for foreign terrorist organizations. And in pursuit of this, they systematically staged our home. They went through and put pieces of paper, sheets of paper with alphabet letters on each room. That was the first thing they did. Then they took photos of each room as before shots. And then they set up a camp in our living room right behind you, where anything that was found by an agent to be considered for evidence would be brought and bagged and tagged, and then they proceeded, as Stephanie said before, to go through every bit of our house. You can imagine, with 25 agents over the course of 12 hours, And all of them working diligently, they went through every scrap of paper on every surface, in every file, in every drawer that they could find.
So anything besides records, besides papers, were they taking computers, phones? I mean, were they taking other sources of information?
A lot of people, yes, in our particular situation, they didn't take our computer, which you can see behind us, but they did download all data and take his cell phones and past cell phones and everything that you can imagine. But in terms of that kind of thing, but what I think to add to that is, right here, I'm looking over at the wall, and there was some artwork that I had done of a Palestinian young girl, silkscreen with watercolor, framed art. Certainly not a threat to Americans' lives in the sense that it was a framed painting, and that was taken as evidence. And over by our refrigerator, even artistic refrigerator magnets were taken as evidence. Our son had just come back from travels to China, where he had brought us back souvenirs that he had bought from shops. For example, there was some playing cards, trading cards, kind of a playful gift. And even that, what you can buy, by the way, in Chinatown all across the United States. The second irony, by the way, of that story, in the sense that those were seized, is that his very trip to China was paid for by the State Department. So again, it just shows you how broad the circle was. I believe that they went downstairs to the basement, and I have a small art business in which I make baby onesies as an example. And though I believe that those were, I didn't see it, but I believe that they went through some of my artwork in the basement.
Certainly the warrant called for them to take Stephanie's artwork. It was in the warrant to take T-shirts, bracelets.
Right.
It mentioned that specifically. It mentioned your artwork specifically.
Yes.
Yes. The other thing to kind of explain how the day progressed, we certainly in the beginning were in quite shock, but we were able to call a lawyer, and I think that's kind of an interesting piece of the story, which is that we would have had a lawyer at our house much sooner, as they did in Minnesota, but so many lawyers were at a National Lawyers Guild convention on that day. And the reason that I mention that is we were able to get through to them, and we spoke to many of the people that were at that conference, and they said that there had been already workshops about the very material support law that was being used against us on that morning. So they were able to, really jump into action and make a statement, and quite familiar. So that's so ironic. Later, we were able to have a lawyer come as the day progressed. And we were able to speak to press as the day progressed. And I think that's another interesting thing, that in many situations, the shock prevents people from being, able to know that this is a story that the world needs to hear. And I think that was a very great decision. So by the end of the day, the light had shone on what they were doing. Similar to Minnesota, we had many supporters outside our house, and we had press. And I think that made a big difference in putting what was happening to us in a political context, that it was quite clear that this was being done to intimidate and put fear into activists like ourselves.
I do want to ask in a few minutes more about the so-called material support for terrorism law and your thoughts on that, but I want to back up to the warrant. You mentioned that it specified your artwork as a target for things to take. What else did you see in the warrant? Could you glean from the warrant in terms of, what do you think they were looking for?
It's the warrant described these foreign terrorist organizations that they alleged we were supporting. And it also talked about organizations in the United States, including the Palestine Solidarity Group here in Chicago and other groups that they wanted information on. Recently, we had a chance to travel to Washington, D.C. and meet with the ACLU's national policy staff and Mike German, who's a former FBI agent, and he had read all of the warrants and all of the subpoenas. And this is what he said about them. In looking at them, he said it was clear to him, as someone who had prepared these kind of warrants in the past, that there was no indication that they were looking for anything of a criminal nature. They weren't looking for weapons, they weren't looking for drugs, they weren't looking for money. What were they looking for? He described it as associational materials, First Amendment materials, that they were looking for how we organized the anti-war activities and solidarity activities that we're involved in. And really, the bread and butter, the meat and potatoes of what they were looking for was contact information. They wanted our cell phones. They wanted our address books. They paid special attention to any paper that had names, addresses, phone numbers, and emails written on them. And I would say that's the bulk of the material that they took.
Contact information to, you mentioned Palestine a moment ago, contact information to solidarity organizations elsewhere in the world, or contact information for domestic activist groups?
I can speak to that because, for example, I'm a teacher at Wright College, and I'm the advisor to a student group that calls themselves SDS. So that's one part of my activism. But another part of my activism in the city is with the Palestine Solidarity Group in Chicago, PSG. In Chicago, and a lot of what we do is work on a campaign that tries to stop the sister city relationship between Chicago and a city that's outside of Tel Aviv named Petah Tikva. And we don't feel that the business relationship and the financial relationship and the political and cultural relationship is appropriate for what Chicago stands for. So although we support solidarity and sister city relationships in many situations in this instance, anyway, what I'm saying is that any kind of petition even that people have worked on in Chicago, in which we are criticizing Chicago policy and U.S. policy, that became part of the situation. In my situation, I've never even traveled to any place in the Middle East. So it becomes even more clear that the point is to try and cut up and divide First Amendment organizing in the United States when you have people like myself that haven't even traveled there. So it's not about that. It's about cutting up solidarity, in this instance, petitions, call-in lists, that kind of thing. So
we also learned, subsequent to the raid, that 4 days before the raid, the Inspector General of the Department of Justice had released a report on FBI spying on peace organizations in the United States. The period of the report was 2002 to 2006, and it was very critical of the FBI's involvement. The FBI had sent in informants. They had gone to meetings and rallies of organizations like the Thomas Merton Center in Pennsylvania, the Catholic Workers, and other pacifist and anti-war groups, student organizations, and they had paid informants. They had their own agents pose as peace activists in order to gather information and to repress the peace movement without any indication of any crime actually having been committed. And we came to understand that under the Bush administration, the guidelines covering the FBI had essentially been eliminated, so that they don't even have to show a judge or their superior any probable cause that a crime has been committed or will be committed. All they have to do is indicate to a superior that they think an organization might someday be involved in criminal activity, and they can do any of this spying, any of this repressive activity. So we're the latest chapter in the FBI's repression.
So to be clear, this was not about tracking down records with respect to foreign trips, because you haven't been to Palestine. With the Minneapolis raids, we heard Colombia come up as well, and solidarity work with respect to organizations in Colombia. Have you traveled to Colombia?
No, we've never been to Colombia either. My union sponsored a number of delegations to Colombia to investigate the human rights abuses by the Colombian government against the trade union movement there. You probably know that Colombia is the most dangerous place in the world to be a member of a union. And my union actually adopted a worker from a union in Colombia called Sinal Trainal, which was the union that represented the workers at the Coca-Cola factory there. This man, Luis Adolfo Cardona, they had the death squads, the paramilitaries, which is basically Colombian military off-duty, had attempted to kill him. And he fled, and the State Department brought him to the U.S., and our union adopted him and provided him with a home, and he lived in Chicago for a number of years. And I mean, that's the kind of solidarity work that we've been involved in, and sending delegations to, helping to send delegations to Palestine and to Latin America to learn about those kind of human rights abuses. That's the kind of things that we've supported, but we ourselves have never traveled.
And they knew that. They seized our passport in my situation, and yet I'm quite sure that before they even entered the door, they knew that neither of us had been to those countries, or so it just really reflects. When we've been saying in the media to people, this could have been you, it's quite clear that in that aspect, it really is an attack on all peace activists, on all solidarity activists, on all trade union activists, because they knew that they didn't have people that had traveled there. It's not about that. It's about putting political fear and power and repression against movements, as they've done in the Black Liberation Movement, American Indian Movement, so many examples. The Palestinian community has a constellation since way before 2001 in which these kinds of abuses of raids and subpoenas and grand juries over and over in the Puerto Rican community. Unfortunately, our learning curve is going quite fast, in which we understand how this fits into very much those kinds of situations.
Let's talk then about the material support for terrorism law, which I believe the Supreme Court upheld in June. In other words, it wasn't a new law, it was upheld. I mean, talk about your understanding of what that law means and what the implications are, and have been, how the implications have played out this fall.
The law that people are discussing has its roots, FBI repression has its roots far before 1996. So when people are speaking about 1996, the law was called in I
think International Terrorist and Effective Death Penalty Law, I think is the name of it.
Mm-hmm. And then, of course, as people have spoken about, after September 11th, that was used as an opportunity to ramp it up, somebody said, on steroids in terms of the Patriot Act and other aspects. And then people, when people talk about this summer in June, the Supreme Court ruling, I think that's interesting to understand that it was actually a supreme, that in the lower courts, when humanitarian aid projects made the proposal to go to different places in the world and offer aid, material support in the sense of talking to people about how they can get their situations peacefully resolved through the UN or through other methods, and they proposed that they wanted to go and do these kinds of discussions. In the lower courts, that was considered a legal endeavor in the lower court and then on appeal. So it's only when it got to the Supreme Court that all of a sudden this was considered not allowed. And in fact, when you understand how broad that definition then is being considered, some people have said it in the past, that it is so vague and so broad that all anti-apartheid activism in terms of saying free Nelson Mandela, who at that time was in the ANC, and at that time was considered on the foreign terrorist organization list, would be then considered under this law. Jimmy Carter's work in the Middle East would then be called into question. So it is so vague and so broad as to be just completely let open to the kinds of abuse that you're hearing more and more about.
Just to state the simplest terms of this, we've never given a dime to anyone in any organization in any other country. We're not the only thing we've ever done is we've supported delegations to go and observe the human rights situations in these countries. So no money has gone to even, and I'm not proud of this, but no money has ever even gone to the victims of the human rights abuses. That's not what we've been involved in. We've helped to support, small delegations that have gone to the Middle East and to Colombia to talk to these victims and come back and tell the American people what our government is doing over there. And I think that's the lesson. That's what the FBI and the Justice Department is afraid of. They don't want the American people to know what our tax dollars are going for.
I'd like to hear just kind of a little bit about how long you've been involved in the peace movement, what prompted you to get involved, and how, whether you've seen anything like this before in terms of yourselves, or whether this has happened to others, perhaps during the Vietnam era or before that you've known.
In my situation, I come from an activist family in the sense that both my parents were very involved when they were young, and then later, for example, both of them did many efforts against U.S. involvement in Vietnam. So as a child, I actually marched. My aunt, my parents. So that's been my experience, to know that that it's a valuable and important thing to contribute wherever you are. So I came from an activist background. My first activism was against the Vietnam War. Then we both were active in the student movement. We both were active in the labor movement. Both of us have been union participants in chief steward, executive board, negotiating committee, all of that. He's in SCIU and I'm in AFSCME.
It's a mixed marriage.
We've been together for 29 years, and throughout the entire 29 years we've been active and proud to have 2 children that also have been side by side with us in so many of the protests and organizing. And now that one is in college, and the other one is a senior in high school, we get to watch them on their own initiative do really important activism in different, with MECHA, with SDS, with GLTBQ issues, and it's very, very proud.
I was actually fairly conservative as a boy when I was in high school. I received a nomination to to enter the U.S. Air Force Academy because I wanted to go to Vietnam and win. So it wasn't until I got to the University of Iowa that I became exposed to the truth of U.S. foreign policy, and it made me so angry that I essentially became an activist for life. After being a student activist and, opposing apartheid, opposing U.S. military involvement in Central America, when we moved to Chicago. Actually, we moved to Chicago to be part of the electoral reform movement that brought Harold Washington into office. And then following that, I got a job at the University of Illinois at Chicago and got involved in my union, SEIU Local 73. And my union has done some support work for the workers in Colombia. My union is part of the United States Labor Against the War organization. We've opposed the war in Iraq and the war in Afghanistan, and we've marched and organized against both of those wars. And then, as we've said, Stephanie and I both went further and saw our responsibility to speak out against and especially Stephanie, to speak out against the U.S. military aid to Israel. So that's our history.
We're very also have been able to participate in our children's school and that kind of education issues, and also in our neighborhood in terms of a stop sign on the corner of where we live, but also in terms of our neighborhood in terms of police brutality and wrongful convictions here in this very neighborhood that we live in. So I spent many years working in terms of wrongful convictions on Grand and Central Area 5, and I've been able to help people that were wrongfully convicted to get out and then try to fix the system for other people. Very close to us is Republic Windows and Doors, where there was a worker era. So we both have worker organizing, and so we both have been able to be a part of many aspects of our city's history of politics.
Stephanie, the night of the Republic Windows and Doors occupation, Stephanie got us all in the car, myself and our sons, and we were among the first people to actually enter the factory that evening to do solidarity work with them.
How does this material support for terrorism law that we're talking about? I mean, have we seen this or siblings of this law before, since the Vietnam era, or is this unique?
It is unique in the sense that it expands the definition of material support terribly. Even in the 1980s, we were aware of Central America solidarity activists who dared to take humanitarian aid, for example, to the government of Nicaragua, when Ronald Reagan had the Sandinistas declared when they were embargoed in the mid-1980s. Then humanitarian activists here who attempted to take medical aid and other things were brought before grand juries. The Committee in Solidarity with the People of El Salvador in the 1980s, the FBI spied on them for years, and none of these people were ever convicted of any crime because the law specified material support to be providing money for the purpose of terrorist activity. And what has happened now is this Supreme Court decision, which, just to explain the details of it, just for one more minute. There's an organization called Humanitarian Law Project that wanted to wanted to advise an organization in Turkey about how to use peaceful means to achieve their ends. And this is an organization that was involved in armed struggle in Turkey. And even though they wanted to use peaceful means, they were accused of using of providing material support for a foreign terrorist organization.
But a lot of this situation, you know, as we mentioned, has hit so strongly on the shoulders of liberation movements here in the United States. So, for example, the Puerto Rican community over the past 30 years has had over 29 grand juries investigating every move that they've made, and same thing in the attempt to cut up, divide, put terror and fear into their movements, Black liberation, American Indian. But for example, a case from that one of the 14 a Palestinian knew about was in LA, where they were selling magazines, and they tried to make this a bigger case, and it took years and years before those charges were dropped, and enormous amount of suffering and money, over 20 years before this could be resolved. And one of the things that came out in the situation is that the literature that they were being accused of was being simultaneously sold at the student union just 2 miles away at the newsstand. But it took enormous suffering. There's a case in Dr. Ashkar in which, for the mere situation of refusing to testify, taking the fifth for the grand jury, he was charged with criminal contempt and was found guilty of not participating in this kind of fishing expedition abuse, and was given right now 11 years only for the crime in that situation of not participating.
I'll just say one other thing, which is, and you know, others have pointed this out before too, that since 9/11, these kind of charges have been brought against a lot of Palestinian and Arab and Muslim people in the United States. What is unique about our situation is, with this new Supreme Court decision, it gave the Justice Department the ability or the opportunity to broaden it out greatly, and so they've come after, for the first time, the U.S. anti-war activists. I mean, Hatem Aboudeya, who's one of the 14 of us that's been subpoenaed and whose home was raided, you know, is a Palestinian American. But we see this, and the anti-war movement sees this, as an attack on the anti-war movement, and that's the intensification that is going on.
Yeah, no, I'd love to ask, since September 24th, what's happened? Have you received subpoenas to testify before a grand jury, and what's become of those?
Well, as we mentioned, we did get lawyer counsel in that story where you heard, and quite quickly. We were all 14 asked to appear. The dates, the October 5th, the 12th, the 19th came very quick. All 14 of us had to learn quite quickly. In my situation, even though I had been called for grand jury in the past, we didn't really understand that in that situation, a grand jury, there is no judge. The jury is not a typical jury in that it can be pick and choose to understand bias. So it's really a hand-picked situation in which you can't consult a lawyer. The lawyer is outside. You can't shine the light of the press or understand what, confront your accuser or understand what is the evidence against you. So it's really quite the rigged job that has grown and grown into an abuse situation. And so proudly, all 14 of us took the Fifth Amendment and refused to participate in that kind of abuse. So since then, you could say, by the way, of the 14, we wanted to explain that there's such a diversity of areas of activism from labor and anti-war, but there's trade union and immigrant rights activism. In some situations, it's people that are white, but in other situations, we have an immigrant Vietnamese family in Minnesota, as well as a Palestinian here that comes from an activism background of even his parents of immigrating and participating. So we have a grandmother, she's a great-grandmother. We have many, many people with little children in certain situations where both of them were subpoenaed. In some 6 out of the 14 chose to do paperwork in terms of who would have to do temporary custody of their children. So, and others had partners that were not subpoenaed, but little children, 1.5, 5 years old, 6 years old. The 3 that were called, you can say.
Oh, 2 weeks ago, 3 of the 14 people who had been originally subpoenaed had their subpoenas reactivated, and they're waiting for their lawyers to communicate with the U.S. attorney to learn what the new grand jury court dates are going to be. But it's many people got the impression that when the subpoenas were withdrawn, when the 14 all refused to testify, many people got the impression that we were off the hook, and clearly the Justice Department is going forward with this.
If they are offered immunity, those 3 people, and still refuse to participate in this witch hunt, then they can be put in civil contempt, which would be federal prison, while for the duration of the grand jury. And the grand jury in our situation began in August of 2009 and lasts for 18 months. But they can convene a second grand jury. And to understand that the prosecutor runs those shows, 98% of grand jury situations go with what the prosecutor tells them. So these people would be in jail while the prosecutor presents any kind of extreme. They also could be held in criminal contempt, and then that gets into the situation where they would have a court, but a more traditional court. But as I told you, somebody got 11 years for the crime of just criminal contempt.
And one other comment about the warrants and the subpoenas. Michael Ratner, who's one of the directors of the director of the Center for Constitutional Rights in New York, he said in a recent interview after reading all of the subpoenas and warrants that he saw no indication of any crime being alleged to have been committed that they had any proof for, and that the scope of the warrants were so broad that it really is accurate to term this whole thing a fishing expedition.
Have we talked yet about the context of, you mentioned August 2009, you were subpoenaed before, or there were warrants before?
Remember that all of this really was a shock. We have found out since that the grand jury was convened in 2009. We didn't know that. And just we don't know all the 14 people. Some of whom we do. One of the things we have seen is that many of us participated in the Republican National Convention protests in Minnesota, and so perhaps this became part of the state response to that very strong and powerful political statement that the movement made outside the Republican convention. So we have since kind of backtracked and understood that kind of a timeline, but we didn't know it at the time.
The 3 whose subpoenas have been, I guess, reinstated, any idea, any guesses as to why it's those 3 and not the other 11?
We don't have any idea. I mean, all three have been involved in solidarity activism from their, from the profiles that are posted on the website. They all three traveled to Palestine. Although I believe Sarah Martin, the 71-year-old great-grandmother, she actually never actually got into the country. The Israelis refused her entrance.
I mean, they must be put in an awful position where they're essentially being asked to testify against the rest of you, or at least testify against those causes and people they've supported.
Yeah, it's a fishing expedition, and all of us recognize that there's no truth to the allegations about material support. And all of us recognize that the FBI has a long history of repression of the anti-war movement. And all of us recognize that the grand jury is an unfair and really an immoral system that many other countries, including England, where the grand jury system was first invented, have stopped using the grand jury system because of its undemocratic and abusive history. So all of us recognize that, and so all of us have said we're not going to participate. Now these three have to, and their lawyers have to make a decision again. But as Stephanie said, if they continue to refuse to testify, the consequences are going to be pretty profound.
One thing that some of them have mentioned is that the situation for people internationally in their situation of travel is even higher, because people in many of these countries that we're discussing, the stakes are that they could be found the next day killed. Certainly people who have protested at the School of the Americas have heard of many of these kinds of stories in which activists wake up to find people in their family killed. So even though they're being offered immunity, which, by the way, doesn't mean that they're free of the fear that they themselves will be charged. It just means that their testimony would not be used against them. So the situation is not just a solidarity of the 14, but for the whole movement, and for the world.
I wanted to ask what resources you've appealed to and you appealed to for help since the September 24th FBI raids. I mean, National Lawyers Guild, attorneys, any other resources to which you two or the 14 in general have appealed?
Well, that's luckily this video ends on a quite an inspiring note, which is we've had enormous support. And although the story began just the two of us in the house and in shock, the story ends where we really have seen that the peace movement and the Palestinian community over and over again, every kind of movement has risen. And you can look on the national website, stopfbi.net, and see over, I think, 120 at this point official solidarity statements, and over 1,000 people internationally have called their embassy. In the Lawyers Guild example, they hired within days a special worker only to deal with this. But over and over again, we have in Chicago a union Teamster local in which over 30,000 members, I think, have voted to send a letter of solidarity. Certainly our specific locals, but even beyond that, enormous labor, enormous church, but not just church, every organized religion that we have has just jumped to stand with us. Quakers, Unitarians, many Muslim and Jews and Catholic. So many religious organizations have just jumped to participate without knowing any of the 14, frankly. So it's certainly not our friends. When an indigenous group in Latin America, a native tribe, sends a letter, you know that it's not about who did they know of the 14. It's about a belief. So the good news is that there's been protests across the country, over 60 protests. There's plans for a legislative component. There's certainly hip-hop events and cultural events, enormous press support. There was just, I think, online that a statement that went to over 20 million people. So incredible. There's a call for, there's been national meetings and national phone calls and call-in days and weeks of action. There's a week of, there's a national protest being called in January in Washington. Over and over again, the creativity and the anger and the organization, that part is the inspiring part.
Do we know when in January that Washington demonstration is planned for?
Yeah, it's January 15th.
Any other details you want to share?
Well, it's actually been called by, it's not been, we aren't involved in the calling of it. It's Cindy Sheehan's campaign.
But it's an example of creativity, initiative, and anger.
What we're doing right now is this week there's a national week of action directed at legislators. So on Monday morning, we're going to be going to the office of Jan Schakowsky here in Chicago. At the end of this week, we're going to be holding another fundraising event. It's our annual People's Thanksgiving. And in cities around the country, there are going to be protests outside of FBI headquarters or at legislators' offices. And we're also urging everyone to call their legislators to ask their legislators to write letters to Attorney General Holder opposing the FBI raids and the grand jury.
We're so grateful for you two speaking with the uptake. Anything else you'd like to add?
Well, we want to say thank you for this interview, but also for all of the support that we have gotten. And we want to say thank you for the work that they've done, but also we want to say keep on. Keep on for the people that get to hear this video. Keep on being brave. Keep on doing the organizing that we all believe is correct and must be done. So hopefully we are a part of it, and we have been a part of it, and we will be a part of it. And that's really what this whole story is about, to keep on, be brave, be bold, take to the streets and organize, make things better in the world.
You mentioned Illinois Representative Jan Schakowsky, and I know that the Minnesota peace activists have been courting or attempting to appeal to Senators Al Franken and Amy Klobuchar and Representative Keith Ellison. Have there been any national politicians that have stepped up, or that have spoken or addressed this cause?
Actually, Ellison wrote a letter to Holder, which is what we're trying to duplicate in all these other districts. And there have been, well, I traveled to Washington last week and met with we met with 4 congresspersons and the staff of 11 others. And in every situation we found every single one of them expressed tremendous concern about the FBI's repression of peace groups. There was greater and lesser degrees of awareness of our case, but the universal response was that the FBI is in need of much greater oversight.
Were these representatives representing Midwestern states where this is going on, Illinois and Minnesota, or more progressive representatives?
Most of them are members of what's called the Progressive Caucus, although not all of them. Some of them were people who are just representatives of districts where people were raided or subpoenaed. We're also going. I'm going back with a delegation again this Wednesday and Thursday, and I'm hoping to get to meet with Senator Durbin or a member of his staff.